Hello there, Evie here, and welcome to my review of the Signum SG1V EVO TG ARGB. It's a very long name, and it's actually not a bad case. It has got some issues. We'll get into that throughout the whole review. I've actually been able to nail this one down to less than 15 minutes, depending on how long I talk for now. So let's cut that short. There are timestamps in the video description and the first comment, pinned comment, as usual. So if you want to skip to any particular part of the video, please do. And if you do like this, then I'll say it now, there are Amazon affiliate links in the video description because most people don't make it to the end. So if you do want to pick it up, check the prices out in there in your various regions and consider buying through there because it will give me a small kickback. Otherwise, hope you enjoy the review and I'll catch you at the end for a conclusion. Much like a pistachio nut, I don't care much about the shell unless it's tough to open or the nut is ruined inside. So in that sense, this case is much like a pistachio nut that's been smashed to shit by a mallet. No, to be fair, it's just the packaging that's damaged, but this polystyrene is really thin and I wouldn't be surprised if these things were damaged in shipping fairly often. Moving on, first impressions are strong. The Signum SG1V EVO TG ARGB has a very long name, but also a bold and striking front panel with tantalizing hexagonal side intakes. We've got a very standard top I/O with a couple of USB 3.0 ports that's joined by a magnetic top filter, which is flush with the top of the case. The back of the case is very standard, bottom power supply unit, top fan and rear I/O position, and snap-off PCI Express slot covers. At least there's a replaceable top cover, and you can snap them off without hitting the motherboard, unlike the MB311L from the last review, but this snap-off PCI Express slot cover thing is starting to become a trend maybe. There's a flat steel side panel that doesn't harbour any complaints, but you could consider the placement of the side panel window to be a little cheap or simplistic. It works without a problem, but it's essentially face-fixed and sticks out like a sore thumb. And removing it replaces some emphasis on stick. I'm not sure why exactly some of these grommets came unstuck from their screws, probably something to do with the adhesive. Anyway, removing the panel is the same as any other, but a nice to have is how the grommets hold the panel in place without the screws. Not too bad. Normal screws on the steel side panel, nothing to complain about there, but pulling off the front panel is a little different to most. It's actually kind of the opposite to most cases. Where you'd normally have a cutout under the bottom, you have a protrusion which forces your hand down into the desk, giving you very little room. It's not a big problem, just sliding the case to the edge of the desk solves it, but might be an issue for having the case on the floor. It's just puzzling to do this over the norm. I have to say though, I like the front panel on this thing. It's kind of interesting. There's a baffle of sorts on the inside that, as far as I can tell, is there to cleanly focus light from the front three 120mm ARGB LED fans, which are minimally secured, which isn't super strong, but maximizes airflow. There's also one to the rear. But back to the baffle, for all I know, it could help with more linear airflow as well, or something like that. There are also filters to the side intakes, which seem more like a vacuum from the outside job than conveniently removable ones. There's also capacity for up to a 360mm radiator in the front, a 240mm radiator up top, or a couple of 140mm fans, and two 120mm fans in the base of the main compartment. I really don't know why. It's not like there's a need to maximize airflow into any power supply unit, really, and there's not much intake area to feed air into the graphics card due to the power supply unit underneath, unless you go for an SFX power supply unit, but then we're throwing in some really weird compromises. Anyway, covering the ARGB aspect of this case, I think they've done an excellent job here. Not the cleanest, lots of wires around, but it's got the goods. To get into it, we need to open up the parts bag, which reveals all sorts of screws. Not sure about the long screws. They should be or could be for the basement fans, but there's only one set of them. Anyway, there's a speaker that's useful for diagnosis sometimes, some spare grommets, a cloth to wipe down the glass, and finally the ARGB controller, which we'll get into now. So the back of the motherboard tray is a 5-fan, 4-pin PWM hub and ARGB splitter. So they've covered the case fans, which are all 3-pin fans, unfortunately, and have a leftover slot for, say, your ARGB AIO or something. Connectivity-wise, you've got one output that has two different connectors. It's a pass-through, so you can use one or the other. One larger ARGB connector for controllers and boards, or you can use the smaller, squarish connector for gigabyte boards. The other cable out of the hub is a 4-pin connector for PWM control through or from your board. Although for the ARGB aspect of things, you don't have to use a board or buy a controller. They've actually supplied one. It connects to the universal ARGB connector and is controlled by the reset switch, so you can cycle through modes and colors, that sort of thing. It's powered by a SATA connector straight from your power supply unit and is super small, so you can throw it virtually anywhere you fancy inside the case. Let's move on to drives. There's a 3.5-inch drive cage within the basement, which, believe it or not, takes 3.5-inch drives and 2.5-inch drives. Not the case all the time. The cage itself has a couple of positions, FX and SP. I must have missed the memo on that. In its furthest back position, you've got about 60mm of space for fans and a radiator, and about enough space for a 150mm power supply unit. But shift it forward and you've got about 180mm for the power supply unit, but you'll be out of room for a radiator past the basement cover. Courtesy of SilverStone, I've got a 140mm power supply unit to throw in here, but I had to slide the drive cage forward to get it in. However, I was able to slide it back to allow more room for the front for a radiator. Like I said, you might be able to squeeze a 150mm power supply unit and get that radiator in the lower front area, but I'd stick to 140mm to make life a little easier. 2.5-inch drives now. This is about as cheap and cheerful as you can get for installations. No fancy grommets or sleds, just some cut and bent metal with holes and screws. They're even bendy bits of metal. It's crude, but it does work, and it's up to you whether you like it or not. Something I've grown accustomed to is cable management before installing the motherboard. In cases like this, it's especially important, at least to get cables in like the CPU power connectors to the top right. There are enough points to strap cables down here, but there's really not a great amount of space for excess cables to be placed. If you don't need that 360mm front radiator, I'd slide that drive cage forward. It might just save you a fair amount of hassle fighting the side panel back on. You may have noticed the removal of the fan hub, but that was purely to raise the standoffs holding it in place to explore an idea of mounting the NZXT grid on the other side for controlling the fans for testing later. Turns out there wasn't enough room due to the width of the board, but it did hide away fairly well at the top of the main compartment with a velcro strap going through the fan slots. Not too noticeable with the top filter in place. Now for an ATX board test fit, since my test system uses a micro ATX board. You can see why you want to get the CPU cable in place first. The space is very tight, but the lower cable management holes are very nicely positioned to not cause any issues. As for the actual test system, with a big cooler in place, you'll want to have small hands to get through to the CPU power connector, or install the cooler afterwards since the motherboard cutout is well sized to the rear. The graphics card installation was trouble-free. I'm not 100% happy with the snap-off PCI Express slot covers though, but like I said earlier, at least they've added one removable and replaceable panel to the top, and there weren't any clashes with the boards when removing any panels. Like I said, the installation process was problem-free, although I do want to know what the general consensus is about these types of sliding screw cover panel things. I like that they block the gap, but they seem to be more of a hindrance during the installation process. So that's the build. Well, most of it anyway. We've got some fans to play around with, so it's time for the panels to return and the testing to commence. I'll highlight all of the parts worth mentioning and won't re-explain all the details as I have in other videos to be more concise in this one. A video to come on that in the future. We've got a few tests to perform, which are the stock masks, optimal acoustic, and optimal max tests. I first ran the stock max test, so all stock fans were running at full speed to get an idea of the best case scenario for thermals with this system and worst case scenario for acoustics at stock. So we've got 3 120mm intake fans up front and one 120mm exhaust fan to the rear. Before we touch on the thermals, let's see what we're comparing. So, we've got the Micro ATX Cooler Master MB311L, which is just over 1 litre smaller and comes with only two 120mm ARGB fans. Fans in both the Signum and the MB311L are running at around 1200 RPM, with the Signum being just a touch louder than the MB311L with 2 additional fans. We've also got the same system on a test bench with the same cooler but no case fans. As for the test results from Priority 5 and Thermark, despite the Signum only being a touch louder than the MB311L, it pulled well away from the MB311L with GPU thermals, taking on the open air test bench, although the test bench was a fair bit quieter with no case fans. The CPU thermals were more comparable, but still a clear lead for the Signum. I also ran the stock max test with the less CPU demanding Firestrike combined looping test, and again, it's a clear lead for the Signum. Those 4 fans are doing well, and they're at a speed where they're not very loud, and there's enough of them to evenly shift air throughout the entire case. Let's move on to the second test setup, optimal acoustic. This one requires all the stock fans to be removed and up to 5 pre-selected test fans to be installed. Since this is the acoustic test, these fans will be speed limited to hit 36.5 dBA noise output measured at 40 centimeters away from a 45-degree angle from the front of the case. All in all, we have 3 front intake fans as before, 1 rear exhaust fan, as before, and an additional single fan up top as an exhaust. With the acoustic limit, the Signum falls well behind the test bench. If you're new to this channel, you might not know that the CPU and graphics card's fans are locked to the same speed throughout all the testing and all the cases. Just the case fans are changing speed in all this testing, which explains the drop in performance when we're running fans quieter than the previous setup. There's still a healthy lead in the GPU performance for the Signum over the MB311L, but no lead in CPU thermals. But here's the interesting stuff, the fan speed in both cases was the same. I actually averaged the speed of all the fans in the case to get these figures, so it's really surprising that the average of all the fans matched. Bit weird. Same setup, but back to the Firestrike test, it's more of the same here. Virtually identical CPU thermals and better GPU thermals for the Signum. Turning the fans from the acoustically limited speed of 640 RPM, at least in these cases, up to just over 2000 RPM gives us some interesting insight. Firstly, it turns out the Signum has a quieter case design than the MB311L, at least at high fan speeds like this. They both have all the same fans running at nearly identical speeds in exactly the same positions, but I have a feeling the front baffle of the Signum is preventing a fair amount of noise from leaking out the front of the case. I also found ramping the fan speed up didn't separate the cases in CPU thermal performance, but we're seeing the GPU thermal performance gap increase from about 3.5 degrees Celsius to over 10 degrees Celsius. However, the fans are spinning at over 3 times faster, so that makes complete sense. Same rough result for the Firestrike testing. And lastly, I want to cover the price. Considering its size compared to the MB311L, which make them very comparable, with the extra fans you get, and the PWM and ARGB hub and controller, it's a really solid deal for the Signum at £65 or €60. I don't think they sell it in the US, which is a shame. We can even look at price versus performance, and you can see that if you're buying this in Britain, it's neck and neck with the MB311L, but in Europe, where the price is a chunk lower, it's an outright better deal. Here's the individual GPU price versus performance and the individual CPU price versus performance. Pause at your leisure. There are a few rough edges, like the window being face-fixed, the 2.5-inch drive mounting being a little flimsy, the power supply inlet filter being, again, flimsy, mostly snap-off PCI Express slot covers, which feels like a trend developing. But if you can get past those, then you've got yourself a really good deal here, especially if you can find it in a sale. So there we have it. I hope you enjoyed the video. I did a little bit of a conclusion just then, so I do think this is a nice case. It does have some issues. If you can look past those, like I said, it's a great case. Those fans seem to do a great job. Even though they're 3 pins, they're slow enough at their maximum speed that they don't create too much noise, so you can half that speed down and it will be relatively reasonably quiet. If you're going for silent though, with every case fan, you're better off swapping out for something nicer, like say your Noctua fans or what have you. So anyway, thanks so much for checking this one out. I'm going to cut this super short now because I might be able to get this video under 15 minutes. Not unprecedented for the channel, has happened twice before on case reviews, but that was about 2 years ago. So, as I was, thanks for checking this one out. I will catch you in the next review. Videos here. Join the channel, subscribe, Patreon up there if you want to support the channel any further, and I'll catch you in the next one, which may be some really budget cooler reviews.